we have part two, of course, of Dawson's book. We're going to take a little bit of a different track than we did last week, several weeks ago. The focus now will be Dawson presenting certain dilemmas in Western education and some possible solutions to those dilemmas and those problems. We will do a presentation of slides and visuals of art. It's my homage, as I mentioned last time we met, to an old mentor of mine, Father James Donnellan, who instructed many students in the Philippines by the use of art and things beautiful. And I hope to somehow pay a little bit of an homage to him in using that medium to share my information also, and Dawson's information, of course, as well. We'll be looking at 4 slides before break, and then continuing with 4 after, so a little bit less slides than we had last time. But we're looking at a much more, how should we say, last time we met, it was a chronological sketch of different eras of art and education, as Dawson was presenting this in the first part of his book. Today, we're going to focus on certain dilemmas that Dawson presents and his solution to these dilemmas, with the introduction of a more Christian-centered education with regards to that. Now, we'll begin with a few slides at first, just so you guys know the pictures I'm showing. I've been very fortunate to travel a little bit with my wife and kids. So these have been pictures from travels, different places, locations, and museums in Europe mostly, to show us these pictures. Okay. That being said, so we'll focus on our first theme, if you will, for the first part of today. I'd like you to think about, we had the theme from last time being telos, the Greek word meaning purpose of something. I'd like you to think of a little bit of a different theme this time. For the first part of our discussion, I'd like you to think about the West as a distinct culture, a distinct civilization, and one that values, we will see this in the visuals and in the readings from Dawson, one that values the individual, the value and the worth of the individual. I will show you this in different forms, in different ways, with different works of art, and then we'll go on our break, and we'll have a little bit of a different track past our break time where we have discussion. Okay. Before we look at this work of art, I'd like to read from you a section from Dawson's book. I'll get to the description of this work, of course, very old work of art from the Assyrian civilization, many centuries ago. So let's look at, I'm looking at page 91 of the Dawson book, where he begins presenting the problems inherent in Western civilization, or Western education, I'm sorry. Let me begin with the first paragraph of that page. One of the chief defects of modern education has been its failure to find an adequate method for the study of our own civilization. The old humanist education taught all that it knew about the civilization of ancient Greece and Rome, and taught little else. In the 19th century, this aristocratic and humanist ideal was gradually replaced by the democratic utilitarianism of compulsory state education, on the one hand, and by the ideal of scientific specialization on the other. Skip a paragraph down to the 3rd paragraph on that page. Now, the old humanist education, with all its limitations and faults, again, this is from Dawson, possessed something that modern education has lost. It possessed an intelligible form, owing to the fact that the classical culture which it studied was seen as a whole, not only in its literary manifestations, but also in its social structure and its historical development. Modern education has lacked this formal unity because it has never attempted to study modern civilization with the care and earnestness which humanist education devoted to classical culture. Consequently, the common background of humanist culture has been lost, and modern education finds its goal in competing specialisms. The dilemma that Dawson brings out with this passage is one wherein Western education has, for some reason, or a variety of reasons, stopped to study itself. The ancients, of course, did not do this. They were very well aware of what they were, specifically the ancient Greeks. They knew what they stood for, and they also knew what they were not. They would look at other civilizations around them and compare these civilizations to themselves, write histories, of course. Herodotus the first, Thucydides a little bit later on, wherein you would see Greece and Greek culture, Western culture, differentiated from other aspects of, from other civilizations in the area in which they lived. I'm going to focus on 2 main legs, if you will, of the table of Western civilization for this portion. And those 2 legs correspond to 2 cities. The first of these, Athens. The second of these, Jerusalem. We will tackle Rome a little bit later on, probably after break, but these are sort of the 2 legs that build Western civilization and give it its ethos. So going back to this work of art, again, this is an Assyrian wall carving or relief. This was found in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, in Museum Island. This is dated to around the 9th century or so BC. It shows a lion hunt by the Assyrian king Ashurnarpal II. This was located, by the way, in a palace of Ashurnarpal. One of the walls of this palace was lined with this work, along with other works, presumably to impress visitors to this palace, to show them the power of the king, so to speak, or the dominion of the king, as he ruled over the ancient Assyrian people. Just a small side note on a Near Eastern history, the Assyrians were one of the first, if not the first, true great empires of the ancient world. Many of the things that Rome would do later on, the Assyrians were already doing a millennia before. They would have a very advanced military. They would introduce a uniform military, not meaning you're wearing uniforms, but in a sense where you're teaching people in this military the same things. You're making the training uniform. You're also arming them the same way. Iron, of course, becomes a very popular commodity during this time period, which the Assyrians will put to use. Now, the Assyrians would conquer great areas of land, civilizations you've heard of before, the Egyptians, the Neo-Babylonians, the ancient Hebrews as well. There is a poem by the Romantic poet Lord Byron called The Destruction of Sennacherib, one of the great Assyrian kings, in which Byron says, "The Assyrian came down unto the fold, his cohorts gleaming in purple and gold. And the sheen on their spears was like stars in the sea, as a blue wave blows nightly on blue Galilee." Now, the Assyrians coming down into the fold, the idea that the Assyrians are almost wolf-like, coming down to the fold of sheep, if you will. The Assyrians were known for their conquest. They wanted to portray this in their art as well. If we look at this picture, we of course see a scene of King Ashurnarpal hunting a lion. We cannot say from this that the Assyrians were not skilled or artful in the way they depicted images with their graphic arts. If one looks at the horses, there is great detail. Even in the tapering of the jaw of the horses, there is motion occurring, with the horses presumably mounting upwards in order to defend itself or themselves against the lion. The detail on the lion head itself is quite stark and quite impressive, I would say. A lion fiercely roaring back, its last great roar, before, of course, being slain. It's already being punctured numerous times with arrows. One thing to note, though, when we look at this sculpture or this relief from the ancient Assyrians, the king over here, what is his relationship and why is he doing this practice of hunting lions? This is a small side note, but bear with me on this one. The French diplomat and political philosopher, if you will, Alexandre de Tocqueville, will write 150 years ago something very interesting about American democracy. He will say, in comparing liberty and equality, two virtues which, of course, a very young United States is striving very mightily to maintain and to keep together. He will say of equality, it is the easier of the two virtues compared to liberty. Liberty takes effort. Freedom takes effort. You must strive for this. You must sometimes strive to the point of physically damaging yourself, or to the point of dying for this liberty. Equality, Tocqueville says, is actually a lot easier to get. All you need for equality, it's very simple. All you need is a king. All you need is somebody above who levels and makes everybody else under them, under whichever king that is, lower or equal to each other. Now, with that in mind, let's look at what the king is doing in this relief. King Ashurnarpal, of course, is hunting this lion. One very interesting note in the way he is doing this. If you notice, the lion is staring directly back at the king who is slaying him. But notice, if you will, the perspective of the eyes of the king. They are following the trajectory of the arrow, which is parallel, going in this direction, not regarding the lion at all. Almost as if the lion is important, he is to be slain, fine, but I'm moving on to something else. There is something more to do. There is something more to kill, to conquer. I am not stopping in my conquest for any reason, even though I've bagged this great lion, this great prize. Now, what was the purpose of the Assyrian kings hunting lions? Well, it was a show for the Assyrian people that the king was their protector. He would protect them against the forces of nature, as we see very eloquently with this carving of the lion's head. If I could bring up an old poem by Tennyson, this is nature red in tooth and claw. This was a very violent time. This was a time in which humanity's struggle against the forces of nature was quite paramount. The king needed to show his people that he was the master of this, that he was not going to be defeated by any waves of nature in whatever form. He would be its conqueror. But the interesting thing about these lion hunts, a little bit of research on this, was that they did not necessarily occur in the wild. These were, to use terminology based in the 21st century, 20th century, these were canned hunts, meaning hunts that were planned. Lions were caught, they were put in cages, they were then let loose into an arena where the king in his chariot and his hunters would then go on to kill these animals. One thing that is kind of glaring by looking at this rather violent spectacle of the king doing this, slaying this lion to show the people his might and his strength, if we think of art as something, and perhaps I'm overly sentimental, I'd like to think that art should involve something of beauty in it, something beautiful, something to lift the spirits. When one looks at art from Assyria, from this period of Assyria, of course, before it was converted to Christianity later on, and eventually the Middle East went under Muslim rule as well. If you look at the art, there is skill, there is craft. We can't say it's crude. There are, by the way, just as a side note, there are examples of chariot-based warfare, not necessarily lion hunts, that very much resemble what the king is doing here from an even older civilization, the ancient Hittites. Much more crude and unsophisticated in the way the horses and the men are arrayed. The Assyrian artist, in this sense, has perhaps much more, how should we say, much more facility in the way he communicates what is occurring in this event. However, that said, there is one thing that is largely absent in this scene. And that thing is gentleness. There is no modesty, there is no softness, there is no mercy, if you will, being shown to the lion. He is giving his one last great roar before the king brings him down. By the way, is the king even paying attention to him as he's bringing him down? Not necessarily. He's on to the next line or the next conquest in that sense. This was a time and a period that was, how should we say, a very difficult one, not a very easy one to live under. One wherein the king, through his brutality, and by the way, Arshonarsipal, it was widely known in the ancient world for being, it's hard to use these kinds of words, one of the most brutal rulers of the ancient Middle East. He was known for having quelled a rebellion in one of his conquests in Asia Minor by slaying a whole bunch of people, setting their children on fire as an example, and building little minarets and towers of limbs that he would lop off people. This was not a gentle time. This was not a gentle king. This was a king who may have granted equality to people, but only in the sense that they were under him. It was a downward proposition. It was a verticality directed from the king down towards the people. The actions of the king in this painting, in this relief, very much reinforce this ideal that the king is above. We exist at the mercy of this king, or whomever was existing during this time period. Now, I'd like to contrast this, of course, with another picture involving a king, perhaps more, more relatable to us. This is, of course, a crucifix. The artist is the Florentine artist, or pre-Renaissance, I should say, Florentine artist Giotto. A crucifix found at the Santa Maria Novella Church in Florence. I have to give a shout out to my son, José Yulo, who, while he was studying in Florence last spring, it was one of the last days that Joyce and I were there visiting him, and he knew that perhaps I was very fond of Thomas Aquinas, and this was a church, of course, known, Santa Maria Novella, for having the Spanish chapel, showing Thomas, of course, involved, and the Dominican order there as well. This crucifix, if we look at it, is a bit of a break from the older Byzantine style, which we showed last time we met. No longer do we see Christ the King or in Greek, of course, Christos Pantokratos, Christ the all-powerful, the great stoic judge of the universe. Now we have something more resembling something called Christus Patience, a Latin term meaning the suffering Christ, Christ who is in passion, if you will. It is depicted by Giotto here, which very vividly, if we notice the rib, the right side of Christ here, having the blood from the spear on his side. We see his head being downturned. Uniquely enough, and perhaps this is still the influence of the Byzantine, the older Greek Byzantine form of art, we still see gold in this halo in the background. Also in the background of St. John over here and the Virgin Mary right here, both looking at the statue of a dying Jesus. Now, Jesus from the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah, in the New Testament, in the book of John, as well in the book of Revelation, referred to as the king, if not the king of all kings. What is different and how is this different from the Assyrian king you saw a little bit earlier? Of course, there's a world of difference, but how do we encapsulate this? How do we make this in a more tangible form? As someone who, by force of habit, by perhaps the priests of my old Catholic Jesuit school taught me to do this quite often. During Good Fridays, I often find myself in the local neighborhood church, watching, of course, going through the Stations of the Cross and sitting down there until 3 o'clock, the time of Jesus' death, and asking myself philosophically a rather troubling question, or perhaps puzzling question, which is, if Thomas Aquinas is somewhat accurate in his third proof of the existence of God, the proof based on contingency. Now, how that works again, of course, is Thomas Aquinas says 800 years ago that we are contingent beings. Contingent meaning we need something in order to exist. We are not the cause of our own existence. If not for my parents being together and the soft music in the background, perhaps, and your parents, a bottle of champagne on the side, we are not existing today. We needed something else for our own existence. Now, contingency extends not only to us, but to other things in existence as well. Geographical formations would not exist unless you had certain factors in the environment. If we look at things such as planetary orbits, they're probably not existing unless there's something, a force of gravity perhaps, or universal forces causing them to happen. If we begin thinking about contingent things and things that need other things in order to exist, Aquinas would say, eventually you have to come to this one thing that is non-contingent, that does not need anything in order to exist. Now, why does Aquinas say this? Well, Aquinas says, look, if everything absolutely was contingent, and there was nothing that was non-contingent, that always had to be there, then at some point in time, if there was nothing in existence, nothing would ever come into existence, which we, by the way, disprove by our existence right now. So there had to have been, apart from the universe itself, something beyond the physical, metaphysically, something there that is always there bringing everything else into existence. Now, with that sort of percolating in our minds, when I'm sitting down in my local church during Good Friday, and I'm observing, of course, 3 o'clock, the time Jesus died, I begin thinking to myself, why would a being that always has to exist? And if a being always has to exist, always has to, that means that being is a necessary being. That you can't, it's a being that can't not exist in that sense. Why would a being who is so great, who is always present, who is an eternal presence, an eternal being, if you will, why would that being, at some point in time, turn into flesh and blood and then choose to die, presumably for our sins, for the errors of mankind? It is, frankly, rather irrational. It doesn't make too much sense. If humankind committed the sin of disobeying God the Father in Eden and was punished and cast out for this, justice would have it that we don't have any salvation past that point. Justice, by the way, is an old pagan virtue. It's still a pretty good virtue. My old mentor, Father James Shull of Georgetown University, also my sister's professor there as well, once said that justice is a virtue, but it is the most terrible of virtues. There are no loopholes with justice. If one lives a wretched life, if one does bad things, one will suffer for those bad things. There is no loophole or way out of these things, which brings to us something rather unique. By having a being that is eternal, that is necessary, why would it do something so unnecessary? To come into an earthly existence, to suffer, literally to suffer, not only the physical pain of being put on a cross, the punishment for criminals, by the way, but also the metaphysical humiliation of being so great and so large, but now being mocked, having a scroll put above his head, INRI, Jesus Nazarenus, Rex Judiorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Why go through this humiliation by the Romans, of course? Why go through this? Well, perhaps the answer to this is the antidote that this king brings to the problem of justice. When justice is too harsh, when it is too unforgiving, when there are no loopholes to it, there is at times a very human call for something called mercy. If one looks at the Virgin Mary here on, well, it's our left-hand perspective, the right-hand perspective of Jesus on the cross. In the song Salve Regina, sang, by the way, by the pallbearers of John Paul II when he passed away many years ago, as he was about to be buried. The Salve Regina, Hail Holy Queen, Mater Misericordiae, Mother of Mercy. It can be taken figuratively, that of course she is very loving and she is very merciful in choosing to be the Mother of God. But you can go a little bit further and say literally, she is literally the Mother of Mercy, i.e. the act of God coming down to earth, turning into flesh in order to suffer, is not necessarily just. It is the softening of justice, this of course being mercy. The value of the individual under this king is this king on this cross by Giotto. By the way, small side note, the colors in effect, the body of Christ used to be a much lighter shade than it is, of course, now many hundreds of years of patina. It was originally white. You have the black, of course, of the cross and the red of the blood. And of course, above the cross right here where the plaque INRI usually is, the three colors, yes, the innocence of the white, the black of death, connoting this in Renaissance art, and of course, the red meaning the passion and the blood. This king does create, in a way, equality amongst people, but in a very different way than the Assyrian king, the Assyrian earthly kings. This king uplifts people by an act of mercy, by an act of forestalling justice and saying justice doesn't need to occur right now. I am willing to give my life, essentially, to spare human beings from justice, which would be to never enter paradise again, to never see God in the face again. The only reason you would do this, and again, I go back to the irrationality of a necessary being doing an unnecessary thing. There's not too many possible explanations, except that for whatever reason, this king does care about people. Deus caritas est, as Pope Benedict once said. What is God? God is love. Caritas. It doesn't have to be. It would be perfectly okay, rationally speaking, to have justice take its course. But this king says, no, I'm not going to do that. All people are equally loved by me, and I will do this in order to save them, essentially from perdition. A little bit of a shift from here to the next slide. We focus on the actions of kings, the value for the individual. Let's shift to a more, how should we say, practical or pragmatic look or approach in how individuals and their roles in the state differ from each other from a non-Western civilization to a Western civilization. So let's just transfer to the next graphic. This also is from the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. It is tile work, of course, conducted primarily through my research by Babylonian artists and depicting Persian warriors. Now, the Persians, after the Assyrians, were the next great force of the ancient world. They were quite powerful. They would have a very broad domain, The great kings were called great kings, by the way. The kings of Persia, Darius, Xerxes, and their progeny were very much held in very high esteem, very wealthy, very powerful. We're looking at this because there's an interesting way we can examine the role of an individual in society by looking at men in war. You can tell a lot about the civilization by looking at how it arms its soldiers, how it arms its warriors. You can tell a lot about how it values its people and the people who fight for it in that civilization. Now, in this case, you have three examples of the famed and dreaded, by the way, in the ancient world, Persian Immortals. They were called Immortals. They were the personal bodyguard of the great kings. They were called immortal because for any one of them that fell in battle, there would be somebody else to take his place. And therefore, they gave the impression that they never really died because there were just so many of them. Now, if we look at these immortals and how they are arrayed, of course, very interesting, the finery of their garments, sort of patterned garments, very colorful in the way they are dressed. They have corresponding uniform equipment, perhaps learned from the Assyrians. If we notice, each of them has a very long spear. The reason we know these are the immortals of Persia, of course, are these. You focus on these little round bosses, if you will, or counterweights at the bottom of the spears, if you see my cursor right here, made of silver, sometimes gold. These were meant to symbolize the bearer of these weapons were the elite of the Persian armed forces. Now, the long spear was accompanied by a bow, of course, and a quiver of arrows. Under the garments, presumably, was a short sword for closer contact fighting. There was, of course, since these were the best Persian warriors there was some level of scale armor under the clothing. One thing, however, is missing if we look at this ensemble. If we look at how the ancient Persians, their very best warriors, were equipped, it's a rather obvious thing that's missing. None of these warriors have a shield, a basic method of defense against somebody else. Of course, please note, yes, this is the era before firearms. You're still fighting each other with sharp-bladed objects. There is no kind of defense for these soldiers. Now, how so? Well, perhaps the armor of the Persians was just that good that it would protect them, of these immortals at least, that would protect them from too much harm. Please note, though, that aside from the immortals, the other Persian soldiers, who were mostly conscripts, drafted into battle by the great kings of Persia, did not have this kind of equipment or armor. They had much lighter equipment, much lighter, perhaps not even any scale armor at all, just clothing, linen. And their shields, if they even had them, were made of wicker, much lighter. So what is the mentality of arming your very best soldiers with fine weapons? I'm not taking anything away, of course, from these very fearsome-looking spears, a bow and an arrow. Of course, you can conduct ballistic warfare, attacking somebody from very far away. And if they got close in enough, you had a short sword inside that cloak to deal with what you needed to deal with. But when you arm people in this fashion without a shield, you are putting the premium on the damage you want done to the enemy. You are putting the premium on causing the greatest amount of damage first, and then worrying about the fallout a little bit later on. How the Persian would usually attack, they would begin by a volley of arrows, sometimes slings. Then their cavalry would come in from either side, and eventually the infantry would close in to finish up the business of defeating the enemy. You are thinking primarily of offense, not necessarily too much of defense of your men. Perhaps you are thinking that the value of your soldiers, your most elite soldiers, mind you, they were valuable, but they were valuable because they had use. They had utility. They caused the greatest amount of damage on the enemy. Were you kind of thinking as well about protecting the men who you invested many hours to train, to raise them in this way of fighting? Well, you may have maybe thought that way. But the absence of shields tells us something a little bit different. That perhaps the ancient Persian army was not overly concerned with that kind of defense, especially when they're about to come up against a much tougher opponent, that being, of course, the ancient Greeks. On the second day of battle at Thermopylae, I'm sure you've seen the movie 300 or heard of this great battle before. On the first great of battle, of course, Xerxes launches his troops. They fall back and fail against the very brave Spartans and Greeks who hold the pass of Thermopylae in 480 BC. The immortals are then sent in at the end of day one. They fail as well. On day two, Xerxes does something very interesting. He gathers some of his bravest warriors and tells them, attack the Greeks in this great wave. If you succeed, I will lavish you with all sorts of gifts you'd like. Gold, women, etc. Whatever you'd like, I'm going to give you. But if you show cowardice, or if you fail, Xerxes will say, I will kill you in a most horrible way myself. This again communicates the value of the soldier, that you are valuable because you have some sort of use for the king or for the state, but not too much value past that point. Where do we see a difference from this? Of course, we talked about Jerusalem earlier with Judeo-Christianity. Let's look now at the equation from the Greek side, or Athens. These are two Greek Corinthian helmets. By the way, location of this exhibit is the Kunsthistorisches Museum, or the Art History Museum in Vienna, Austria. Two helmets, of course, worn by Greeks. There are differences of the kinds of helmets you probably see if you see ancient Greek helmets. These are called the Corinthian kind, meaning they have very small eye holes. They have a nose sort of protecting, a nose piece protecting the face to a certain degree. When you come to the Spartans, of course, very famously, they will probably have a crest right around the middle, right around here. But in this case, we're assuming these are not necessarily Spartan helmets, but nevertheless Greek helmets used by Greek infantrymen, or basically called hoplites. The origin of that term, by the way, Greek hoplite, H-O-P-L-I-T-E. The reason they were called this is because the Greek hoplite bore, aside from the helmet, bore a hoplon, H-O-P-L-O-N. The hoplon was the great shield of the Greek hoplites, a shield that covered him literally from nose to knee, almost his entire body. But there's a catch. It not only covered him, but it covered the man next to him. The way the Greeks would fight, of course, very tightly bunched together, spears protruding from them in order to stab the opposition, but shields protecting themselves, each individual warrior, but also the warrior next to him. If you notice, a helmet like this has very little peripheral vision. By the way, that's not a very good thing. It's always good to be able to see on many different sides of you if there's a potential conflict happening. Why did the Greeks not worry too much about this? Well, because the specific way in which they fought meant that each man would be responsible for himself, but not only for himself, but for the guy next to him. There is a train of thought that says the democracy, the political system of democracy, of being responsible for the many and not only each individual person, has its training ground in the Greek phalanx, in the hoplite phalanx, in the way they fought. Now, by the Greeks arming their soldiers, their hoplites, with helmets that covered their entire head, with large hoplon shields, with long spears that they could use to keep away an enemy and keep their soldiers from being harmed. They are in a way communicating something to us, not from the Judeo-Christian tradition, but from the ancient Greek tradition that says we have to protect our individual soldiers. They are of value to us. There is something about them that is important. They are not only subjects, which you find with the conscript army of the great Persian kings. Again, no offense against them. That's simply the reality of what the case was. But in this case, in the ancient Greek armies, you had not subjects, but you had citizens, a person who participated in a community, in a polis. And we needed to make sure we enveloped them with as much armor as possible. We protected their lives as much as we could, because their life has a certain value. By the way, there is a modern analogy to this, a much more modern analogy to this, you will find at the end of the Cold War. At the end, I shouldn't say the end of the Cold War, the end of the Vietnam War, which of course was part of the Cold War. In the mid-1970s, the Soviets were doing their research on US small arms. They noticed the kinds of weapons the US was bringing to the jungles of Vietnam. This very light rifle, very different than what the US soldiers fought in World War II with, the M1 Garand rifle. You now had M16 rifle shooting a much smaller bullet, and an even smaller version called the CAR-15. The Soviets began doing their research and began saying, we can do a little better than the Americans here. We're going to take our old palette, our old model of the AK-47 by Mikhail Kalashnikov, created, of course, in 1947, and we're going to tweak that a little bit. We're going to make it the AK-74. little bit different bullet, much faster. We're also going to make the rifle, we're going to build it in such a way wherein there is very little recoil, i.e. the barrel of the rifle will not raise up too much when it is fired. So you can get a lot of volley, basically you can get a volume of lead going down range very, very quickly and harming the enemy very, very quickly. Now, there's a problem, of course, attached to this. I heard this from a retired Cold War veteran, U.S. Army Special Forces, Larry Vickers, has a very interesting point on this. When you are focused on getting ammunition downrange to destroy an enemy, as the Soviets were, they forgot to, well, perhaps they maybe not forgot, but they were not thinking necessarily about the fact that with this new rifle they were using, there was an enormous flash that occurred at the point of fire. Now, during the daytime, you don't really see it too much. But during the nighttime, if you are letting loose round upon round with this huge ball of fire around your barrel, you are basically telling whoever you're fighting, here I am, please send your email or your airmail bullets this way. Essentially, it's almost a prescription to suicide in that sense, unless you move right after you fire. The US will arm its soldiers in the Vietnam War with a rifle, the CAR-15, perhaps I should say carbine, that has at the very end of its barrel a device that hides flashes. It gives up the kind of rate of steady fire or very accurate fire of that Soviet rifle because it wants to make sure that the American soldiers who are using this rifle, some of them it's our most elite soldiers we sent to Vietnam, and we still send to the Middle East today. We want to make sure we protect them as much as we can. So they are not automatic magnets for ammunition when they're fighting at night. A modern day example of this way of thinking. When you have a state that values individuals because of the use they have for the king or for the state, in the example, of course, here in the previous work of art from the ancient Persians, and now you have a little bit of a different way of thinking. The ancient Greeks showing that no, we are different from these great and powerful kings of the Middle East. We may be smaller, we may not be as wealthy or as powerful, but we find value in our citizens, in our people. They are important. We will go above and beyond to make sure, as best we can, that we protect them, their lives as much as possible. Now, at this point, I'd like to stop and ask if you'd like to, I'm going to stop share and ask if you'd like to have any questions during this time before we begin again on the second part of the presentation. Any questions, though, on how the individual and the state, if you see any permutations of this today, modern day sort of paradigms of this, of the individual having importance in this sense?
I have a question, Jose.
Yes.
Actually, from Manila. Yes. Can you speak a little about the value of the individual soldier as citizen and how that is linked to the idea of freedom in terms of the Greeks? Yeah.
It's a good question. Thank you. The Greeks believed that freedom was not the absence of restrictions. It was not the idea that I can do whatever I want. The Greeks believed that the surface level of freedom, something they called freedom from, meaning no one was telling you what to do. Xerxes was not telling you what to do. Ashur-Narsipal was not telling you what to do. You were as much as autonomous as you could be within your polis, within your city-state. In order for you not to be taking orders from somebody else, to be free from them, it was not enough to simply say you were free. Because with that freedom from nobody telling you what to do, you could still decide to do ruinous things to yourself or to people who are around you. So you had to make better choices with the freedom you had. You had to be able to differentiate which were choices that were better for myself and those who I cared about, and which were worse. This, of course, involved limits. Now, the irony here, and I should mention, the Greeks were also the ones who introduced us to the concept of irony. Not people from Brooklyn. Anyway, side joke. The concept of freedom elevated from freedom from to something the Greeks would call freedom to. This meant that a person now free from anybody telling them what to do was able by themselves to say, I will only go this far. I am willing to impose limits on myself. Now, if you have a group of soldiers fighting in this manner. It is, with regards to the question, it is perhaps appropriate for us to look at a monument that is located in Thermopylae, Greece today, that was put up in the memory of the Spartans who fell, holding that pass for 3 days in August of 480 BC, and holding that against the onslaught of Xerxes and his army. A very simple plaque was put on the ground saying, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to Spartan law, we lie." The Spartans were saying, we are different from the conscript and slavish soldiers of Xerxes because they feared him, and that's why they had to fight. We are freer than them, but we choose to follow law, not a king. That is what separates us. There is ancient Spartan law that says we must defend our people and our polis. And because we choose to do this, we are free men. Hopefully that answers the question a little bit.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
Fletcher has his hand raised.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to ask, is this issue of the state respecting the individual, is this connected to the crisis of Western civilization as a whole?
That's a very broad sort of swath. Which particular crisis are we meaning? What aspect of the crisis? Because there's a crisis of Western education, but the crisis of Western civilization is very large.
I guess specifically, yeah, I would be wondering about with education in particular.
Well, that's actually, I'm sort of saving my Sunday punch for a little bit later on because Dawson does address that. Dawson sees, I'm give you a little bit of a prequel in an effort to answer the question. Dawson says that what begins happening in the West is so much success will eventually lead to a very interesting, very strange human desire to leave our roots, to adopt roots, to adopt ways of something else, to adopt an easier path. It is not easy to be free. It is actually quite scary to be free. Tocqueville will say this. The comparison of liberty and equality I mentioned earlier. Liberty is much more difficult because it takes constant maintenance. It's very hard to get. Freedom is very, very difficult to get. And once you get it, you have to be always vigilant, always careful that you maintain it. It doesn't go away. One thing that, unfortunately, may hasten the dilution of freedom and which spurns a crisis in Western civilization is if we are so successful, we begin to see material success not as outcomes of the hard work we put in, but as the end goal. We confuse things in a way. Aristotle would say we sort of confuse our ends, our sort of, in sort of transitory ends, we focus on the wealth and success as the ultimate end. And in that case, we go astray. We go off path, so to speak. But again, I'm really going to answer your question much more fully a little bit later on when we begin showing more slides, the second part of the presentation as well.
Okay, thank you.
No problem, obviously. Anything at all else from the first part? Please, Mark, go ahead.
To ask, to what extent was the provision of shields and protective helmets simply a practical one of giving the soldiers a feeling of courage that they would otherwise lack if they didn't have that protection?
Very good. I would agree with you that it was meant to embolden a soldier that he was now covered as best as he possibly could be. However, one very pertinent point to bear in mind with the way the Greeks made war. The great civilizations who surrounded the Greeks at their time and before always had an advantage over them in something very simple: sheer number. The Greeks knew they were not as many. They could not field an army, a grand army, into battle like the Persians could or the Assyrians could. Since they were fewer, and since they needed their citizens to play a role in the city itself, the emphasis was on protecting them as best as possible. Since you mentioned courage, Aristotle's definition of courage is if you guys have read Aristotle, the idea of virtue in Aristotle is something that is somehow in the middle of two extremes, right? In order for us to understand courage that Mark brings up, we need to understand a very basic human emotion called fear. Now, a person who is without fear cannot be called courageous, because that person is sloppy, is overconfident, is somehow not really brave in that sense. On the other end of the spectrum, a person who is overcome by fear falls into the trap of cowardice, because that person is just so paralyzed by being afraid of something. The person who is courageous is someone who experiences all of those feelings, specifically the emotion, the very visceral emotion of fear, especially in battle, but nevertheless puts one foot in front of the other and keeps on going. Now, Aristotle would say courage, unique to it, is that there are different hierarchies of courage. Not all courages are created equal. The highest form of courage was found when the greatest fear was overcome. To the ancient Greeks, when you died, you didn't meet St. Peter with his keys and the pearly gates. You went down to essentially Hades, and you met Father Hades, and you basically were a shadow for eternity. Not a particularly promising afterlife. So for the Greeks, the greatest fear was death that was painful, that would overcome, would then give you the word is valor. This is the highest form of courage, according to Aristotle. Something you only can get, you only truly deserve, if you somehow conquer the greatest possible fear, in that sense. Thank you. Anything else we'd like to, on the first 4 slides? Going okay so far? Okay, so we'll start with the second part of the presentation. I'd like you to think about a couple of, since we focus on the value of the individual in the first part, I'd like you to think about a couple of sort of themes for the second part. The first thing I'll be discussing is one of the great contributions of the Judeo-Christian / classical Greek-Roman civilization, one of its highest accomplishments. And then we'll be focusing on a problem found in Western education. Lastly, we'll be focusing on Dawson's way to combat this, his way of solving the problem. But let's begin first, before we begin screen sharing, let me read you a line from Dawson to sort of frame our discussion for the second part. And that is found on page 93 of the Dawson book. Let me just locate that. Okay. Okay, this is from the middle of page 93, the, let's see, second full paragraph from the top. Again, this is from Dawson. The two great traditions that have contributed most to the development of Western civilization, the inheritance of classical culture and the Christian religion, have always produced an internal tension in the spirit of our culture, which shows itself in the conflict between the extreme ideals of otherworldly asceticism and secular humanism. Yet, the coexistence of both of these elements has been an essential condition of the Western development, one which has inspired all the great achievements of our culture. I'd like you to think about this idea of a tension, of some type of tension at play that is potentially destructive, but also is, in a way, rather fruitful, that can yield benefits in the end. So allow me to screen share the next part of our presentation. This, of course, is a painting of Cain and Abel, a very common theme throughout art history. The artist is Andrea Schiavone, or the Slav, if you will. He was born in Croatia. He was a Mannerist painter, operating in Venice, latter part of the Renaissance. We call this the Mannerist form of art. Mannerism from the Italian maniera, which means style. At the latter portion of the Renaissance, Michelangelo will begin, in a way, experimenting with different forms involving limbs, body limbs, if you will, in rather serpentine fashion, lots of tension involved. There was a push in the latter stages of the Renaissance by artists to make things more and more elaborate, to make things more and more dramatic, if you will. Since we could do things that Michelangelo and Titian and Botticelli before them, since we can do this very fine, and Da Vinci, of course, this very fine craftsmanship in painting, let's push the envelope a little bit. Let's do something that is, how should we say, very, in a 16th century way, let's do something a little bit edgy, so to speak, the idea of mannerism. Now, this is found, of course, as you guys know, this is found in the Pitti Palace in Florence, or the Palazzo Pitti. It is one of a multitude of paintings there. My wife and I, after we did a half tour of the place, had to get outside and get some gelato because there's just too much art to take in. And the gelato is very good in Florence anyway. So again, the painting is called Cain e Abele, or Cain and Abel. And this is, of course, since we are reading Dawson, a most Augustinian painting. And why do I say this? It shows a great tension. When St. Augustine was seeing, 1,000 years before this painting, was seeing his Roman Empire fall because he was being attacked from all sides by barbarians, he was being criticized by pagan Romans who were saying, you know what, Augustine, it's because of this Christianity of yours that we're losing our empire right now. It is the fault of Christianity. By the way, Edward Gibbon will do the same thing 1,000 years later on, that it's somehow Christianity's fault that the empire is now crumbling. To which Augustine will say, one should not find Christianity guilty of what Rome in its origins was actually guilty of first. Augustine brings up the story of the two founders of Rome, two brothers, by the way, Romulus and Remus. Now, you guys know how probably that story ends. They do reclaim the land of their mother from their grand uncle who had seized and usurped their territory, but they now have a problem. What are we going to name this place? Romulus and Remus agree on a game. We'll sit down on a field and count how many vultures we see. Vultures, of course, were the sacred bird of their father, the god of war, Mars. Remus looks up first and says he sees 6. Romulus says, sorry, bro, I got 12. I win this. Remus insults his brother by skipping over a fence that Romulus is building around to show the extent of his domain. By the way, this was a huge insult in the ancient world. This meant that your lands would be as easily conquered as I skip over your fence. Romulus then kills his brother. St. Augustine will say, look at your origins, Rome. Look at your pagan origins of Rome. It was a civilization built on the act of fratricide, of brother killing brother. Going beyond this, if you want to learn about what is the great trouble or the great schism of humanity, let's examine an even older act of fratricide. When Cain and Abel were asked to give offerings to God in Genesis, they gave as well as what was appropriate for themselves. Abel was a shepherd. He gave a choice lamb. Cain was a farmer. He gave some crops. For whatever reason, of course, you guys know this part of the story, God the Father was happier with Abel's. Cain was angry about this and decided he would take out his anger on his brother. He would fall upon him. By the way, please take note, a very interesting stylistic device here. What Cain is using as a weapon up here above the very top of the painting looks like the jawbone of a certain animal. I find that interesting only because we see Samson later on and the jawbone of an ass, this jawbone of a donkey being used. But nevertheless, the jawbone, perhaps connoting, at least from my eyes, that this was a prehistoric act of fratricide. There was no weapon yet. It was Cain basically getting the closest hard thing he could find and then killing his brother with it. St. Augustine will say, the story of Cain and Abel illustrates to us that mankind has inescapably a paradigm of two loves. Love of the earthly city and love of the heavenly city. As Augustine would put it, the first kind of love, the love of the earthly city, amor sui usque ad contemptum Dei, the love of the self to the point of having contempt for God. The second love of the heavenly city, amor Dei usque ad contemptum sui, the love of God to the point of having contempt for the self. How is this seen in the two brothers? Abel is a shepherd. That means he must travel from place to place in order to make a living. Although that, of course, factor whatever that's in prehistoric times. He has to travel from place to place with his flock. Cain is much more attached to the land. The land is what gives Cain his meaning. Augustine is giving us a very interesting warning. He is saying, if we as human beings view the land as a metaphor, as this earth, as the only thing worth living for, many bad things can happen because of this. Cain, of course, is history's first murderer. He then will go on, ironically, to be the first city builder in the book of Genesis as well. Augustine will say, there is a tension that Dawson brings up. There is a tension within every human soul between these two competitive desires: to seek and get the best of what this world can offer, on one hand. On the other hand, to see this world as good. It's not a bad thing. We're not throwing away life. This existence is rather important and beneficial as well. But the other way of looking at it is seeing this world as Abel, as what St. Augustine will call a sojourner, a traveler, one who is here now, in this earthly existence now, but it is a transitory point into another kind of existence that will happen a little bit later. Augustine does not mean, by the way, this should be literally two kinds of cities. The earthly city can be literally a physical earthly city, i.e. the physical earthly state. What the heavenly city is, Augustine describes more as a fellowship, as people who want to share goodwill to each other, who have one great desire to do, who have a desire to do not what they want, but who have a desire to do what they should. Two very different things. Now, as bleak and as brutal and violent as this painting by Schiavone is, and by the way, the story itself is a rather bleak, violent, and brutal story, Augustine will say, there is a point at which some type of equilibrium is reached. Some type of relationship is reached between these two competing parts of our soul, within every human being. And that point is reached when both cities somehow know how to work best together. The earthly city, Augustine will say, can do things to prevent or to at least discourage people from doing bad things. It can jail people. It can incarcerate people. It can harm people if they harm other people as well. It can discourage people from committing crime. But the earthly city has one great weakness. It can't exactly, aside from convincing you not to commit a crime, the earthly city can't convince you to be good, to be virtuous, to want to do what you should. That is the role of the heavenly city. A source of inspiration that should not act like a state, like a physical state, but rather should act as a source of inspiration, a font, if you will, of the water of life in a manner, to inspire people to not only seek what they want, but perhaps also do things that they should. Now, Augustine will say, when you put these two things together, if possible, they can have a rather productive relationship, wherein the earthly city is able to do one good thing it can absolutely do. It can promote peace. The way it does this, at times, is of course making war. But it's only because of this that peace is reached. Now, why is peace important? Because then when we are in a state of peace, we are free to do and choose to do what we ought. If you have ever lived in a very trying time where chaos has been ever present, I grew up in the 1970s, 1980s in the Philippines, some very interesting years during those times where security and safety were perhaps not always guaranteed. It is very difficult to think about doing what we should when we are worried and directly worried about the safety of ourselves and our loved ones. But when we do have peace, or at least a relative sense of security, we can then pursue being inspired to do good things. There is one, of course, interesting example of this. I will show you in the next slide. Not a painting or sculpture this time, but rather the interior. Not coincidence, this church is called the Augustiner Kirche, or the Augustine Church, or the Augustinian Church in Vienna. It is the private church of the Habsburg family. If you guys are familiar with the Habsburgs, of course, they're one of the most influential and wealthiest and most prominent families in Europe for many centuries. It was from their line that the Holy Roman Emperors sort of came from until about the early 1800s. A rather illustrious family, to say the least. This was their private church, built roughly, I'd say mid-1300s or so, Gothic style in the interior. It was where the very famous, of course, Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph married his wife, Empress Sisi, in the 19th century. It was also the site of two great musical works. I believe it was Franz Schubert would pen a mass, I believe the mass in F major, and have this performed in the Augustiner Kirche. And also Anton Bruckner, I believe, would pen the mass in F minor at this church as well. Now, what is noteworthy about this church, and what does it show us about this tension leading to something productive and perhaps beautiful by this relationship of the earthly and the heavenly cities? If you look at this church, especially towards the end, yes, we see much gilt work, i.e. the chandeliers are quite, how should we say, are quite fancy, quite elegant in their construction. As they go closer to the altar, we have much more of a resplendent golden effect happening. But if you look at the tile work on the floor of this church, it is rather humble tile work. The pews themselves, I was fortunate enough to sit in the pews when we did visit Vienna many years ago, are very old. They're very old and wooden. Nothing ornate, nothing in Rococo, marble, or golden style about these pews. Rather humble in their construction. And being the church of the Habsburg family, rather unique in this focus on humility. The font of holy water as well, right here at the bottom of the picture. Nothing overly ornate, fabulous, resplendent about it. It's a stone construction where holy water is then placed in. You can dip your hand and give yourself the sign of the cross. It is something not overly done to show some sort of grand spectacle to people. So why this contrast of the humble with the font, the pews, the tile work on the floor, and the exalted, perhaps with the Gothic style and the gilt work you see in the chandeliers and the altar? Well, something interesting about the Habsburg family. They have a practice wherein the heir of the throne, one who is descended from the bloodline of the old Holy Roman emperors, when that person passes away, something very interesting happens. There is a procession through the streets of Vienna with the body, of course, of the now deceased heir to the Holy Roman Empire. He is brought to another church, not too far away from the Augustiner Church, called the Capuchin Monastery, the Capuchin Monastery, where the lifelong assistant of the emperor will knock on the gates of this monastery 3 times. The first time he knocks on the gates, the abbot inside the monastery will usually ask, who is asking for entry? Who wants entry into this monastery? The servant, of course, of the emperor will say, well, this is, I'm just throwing in an example here in the 1600s, this is the Emperor Leopold, the Holy Roman Emperor, the king of many of these different lands, the protector of the faith, all of these exalted titles. At the end of this servant of the emperor, running through this list, a very, very vaunted list of titles of this great ruler, the abbot, the head monk inside the Capuchin monastery, will say to this servant of the emperor, "Wir kennen ihn nicht." We do not know him. We don't recognize him. The servant of the emperor knocks again. He is asked, who is asking admittance? The servant says, he then gives a list of the emperor's other titles, perhaps more earthly titles, of ruling several different lands, of author of many different laws, etc. But at the end of this long list and this long litany again, the abbot inside says the same thing. Wir kennen ihn nicht. We do not know him. Finally, the servant of the emperor knocks a final time. When the abbot says, who is asking admittance? The servant of the emperor and many of Austria's nobility behind him, who have escorted this casket to this very humble church. What is the response of the servant of the emperor? He says to the abbot, to the question, who is asking admittance? He answers, this is Leopold, a poor sinner. It is only at this moment that the abbot inside the monastery says, yes, you may enter. You will then be buried here. By the way, something very interesting about the Habsburgs, their bodies are buried at the Capuchin Church, but their hearts, uniquely enough, are brought over to the Augustine Church that you see in front of you to be buried in a special location. Why bring up the story of the Habsburgs? It is an example of one of the most powerful, wealthy European families of nobility in world history, realizing that at the end of one's life, one has to be humble again. One never really dies an emperor. One never really dies a king, like Ashurnarpal. When you die, you're pretty much like everybody else. And the Austrian monarchs learned very early on, perhaps their faith has taught them, that when you get to that point, it's a good idea to take stock of things and to say, I hope to enter the greater kingdom, the heavenly city. I hope to enter, but with none of my retinue, none of my, how should I say, entourage of being an emperor. I only enter as a poor sinner in that sense. This is Dawson and Augustine putting together this tension and bearing positive fruit. I would argue, by the way, this is my little 2 cents. I try not to give my own opinion too much, but I'll just put mine out here just for the heck of it. It is perhaps one of the greatest achievements of the Judeo-Christian / Western Greek and Roman civilization. This capacity to envision an earthly society that is inspired by a heavenly city, and having these both work together to produce something unique, to produce something wherein citizens, people who live within these civilizations, are inspired not only to follow law, but inspired to do good things as well, to do virtuous things as well with the time that they have on this mortal plane. Now, before we transition, I have another quote for you from Dawson. We now go to a problem that Dawson will introduce. And that is, of course, found on page 114. Let me just locate that in the Dawson book. Herein, in this quote, Dawson is talking about what he sees as a, how should we say, as a deficiency in modern Western education. It does many things well, but Dawson will say there is one point, or there's one area in which it could stand a little bit of improvement. This has to do with something called a moral order. Having some sort of inspirational base through instruction, through education, that you are producing not only people who are smart, who may be even brilliant, but you are producing people with the education that you give them, who are potentially brilliant, smart, whatever you want to call it, and at the same time, good. It's a lot easier said than done. So locating the quote, this is bottom of page 114 from the Dawson book. Again, this is from Dawson. The great world cultures like China and India and Islam are classical examples of such a moral order. Each of them possesses or possessed a sacred law and system of values on which its social life was founded. The Western world today no longer possesses this principle of moral order. It has become so deeply secularized that it no longer recognizes any common system of spiritual value, the moral concept from its cultural context, and have attempted to create an abstract, subjective system of pure ethics. If this were all, we should be forced to conclude that modern Western society does not possess a civilization, but only a technological order resting on a moral vacuum. Rather strong words, I would say, by Dawson. So let's try, through looking at some art, to make some sense of what he's talking about. A bit more modern in terms of art. I was visiting New York with Joyce several years ago, giving a speech for the American Maritime Association, a Catholic Philosophers Association at Fordham University some years back. And we took a side trip one day to see the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this city, and we were walking through its various corridors, looking at all the great things you could see there. And I turned the corner and I saw this painting, and the first thought that popped into my head, this young lady does not look like she's up to anything good. Why did this feeling or sentiment pop up to me? Well, she's obviously smiling, so perhaps she's happy, maybe. But if we look at what she is holding on her lap, it is a rather large basin. Above this basin in her hand is some form of bladed weapon. I'd call him a neoclassical artist of the 19th century, Henri Regnault. Neoclassical in that you're doing sort of paintings of older classical themes, Greek myths, biblical themes, etc. Regnault, by the way, was a beloved French artist, very young. He passed away in the Franco-Prussian War, unfortunately. I learned from the Met that when this painting was brought to New York, that there was a great clamor in France. The French were not too crazy about this great work being brought over to New York, but nevertheless, there it stays. The title of this work by Henri Regnault is, of course, Salome. If we've read the New Testament, specifically Matthew and Mark, we've heard of the story of the stepdaughter of Herod Antipas, who dances for the king, and as a prize for her dancing is asked to name her price, whatever she wants, by Herod Antipas. She does not exactly know what she wants. She is offered, by the way, by the king, she is offered half of his kingdom. That's not a small offer. There might be some really good, IRAs or 401ks, attached to that. I'm not too sure. But half a person's kingdom is a pretty cool thing. But nevertheless, she goes to her mother, Herodias, who, angered by John the Baptist, tells her daughter, this is what you ask the king. Ask him for John the Baptist's head. Salome goes over to Herod Antipas and whispers to him and says, look, you asked me what I want, right? This is what I want. I want the head of the Baptist. Bring that to me. There is regret. We read this in the New Testament from Herod Antipas. In this, he does not think this is necessarily a good thing to do. He has his issues with John. John the Baptist has criticized him and his wife Herodias for being in an unlawful marriage. He is not too keen on killing this king. This preacher who is housed in his dungeon. But nevertheless, he was publicly heard saying, name your price. And Herod, of course, has John the Baptist killed. This is a unique take on the concept of a moral order. How come? There was a moral order present in the tale, in the narrative. Herod, his father, were all inheritors of Moses' law, which said it is not good that you should not kill people in cold blood. It is not a good thing to do this. Nevertheless, for a moment, for whatever happens in that moment, from Herodias first to her daughter Salome, and eventually to Herod Antipas himself, there is a moment of suspension of that moral order. There is a moment where we know something is wrong, is not as important as what I want at this moment. This concept, by the way, again, my mentor, Father James Shull of Georgetown University, through many lunches I had with him at the Jesuit home before he passed away in Los Gatos, he would always remind me, this concept is called volunteerism. Volunteerism, which means we find out or we say what is right or wrong, not by examining any external source, but merely examining what we think right now. What is it in our will right now to be right or wrong? Thomas Aquinas would say, of course, this is a violation of natural law. It violates, obviously, number one, the first inclination to natural law, seeking the good. Committing cold-blooded murder is hardly seeking the good. It violates inclination 2 and 3 of the inclinations of natural law to preserve the species, to preserve the self and preserve the species as well. Natural law, again, from Thomas Aquinas, is the built-in way that through human reason we could figure out what God considers good or bad for us. It is sort of written into us, or written into our capacity for understanding rightness and wrongness. But what happens with volunteerism what happens is a momentary shelving of our knowledge of natural law. Herod himself regrets his actions. He would not regret his actions if he did not think the act was wrong to begin with. Now, we don't exactly know what Salome was thinking. She was maybe following what her mom said, or she thought it was a pretty cool idea, who knows, to take the head of the Baptist. Nevertheless, this was a moment wherein, instead of figuring out what is right or wrong based on our human reason or on the faith that was inherited to us by our ancestors, we rely on not intellect or faith, but we rely on will. Now, what is the danger to this? Will is very changeable. Will is something that can be one thing one day and another thing the next day. It is not cemented by any way or form. More specifically, if we say, in a very relativistic way of putting it, if we say that what is good and what is right and wrong, that depends on the person seeing it. Relativism, of course. We fail to see the end point of relativism, which is, at the end of the day, if person A says, this is what I think goodness and badness is, and person B says, this is what I think goodness and badness is, there is no way to know which between them, who is more right. Now, if you follow natural law by Thomas Aquinas, of course, if you inherit these traditions from Moses, there's almost a script. It's right there in front of you. You know, we're not supposed to do certain things. But if we shelve natural law, if we shelve faith and reason as telling us what should be right and wrong and merely depend on our own will, what happens? Well, when you have a disagreement, which will obviously happen when two people have two different wills of what is right and wrong, when you have a disagreement, the only way of knowing who is right and wrong is who is physically more powerful. The irony of relativism is that it promises freedom, but in the end, it only gives you tyranny. Tyranny of the strong. Tyranny of nature, red in tooth and claw, as you saw in that frieze of Agenarcepal. This warning, of course, by Dawson, that lacking a moral order, bad things will happen. Now, why bring up this work of art by Regnault, this painting of Salome? I only bring this up because, if you think about it, if the suspension of a moral order can happen in a civilization that already has a moral order, think of the potential damage and danger when a civilization in the future, being untethered to its ancestral teachings, to its traditions, to its culture, to its faith. What happens then when no moral order is even acknowledged? We see guilt in Herod Antipas. There is still something that holds him back. He does go through with it. Don't get me wrong. He does go through with a horrible action anyway, but he regrets it. But envision for yourself a state of being where there is no moral order, where there are no things forbidden. What are the capacities? What are the potentials for damage then? It is truly, I would argue, a potentially disastrous situation, a ruinous situation once that is in place, which is why Dawson is saying a moral order should be part of an education. It should not be shelved because it is not quantifiable, because you can't count it or you can't measure it. It has a role to play. Let me show you one, before I show you one last work of art, let me read one last quote from Dawson to sort of round us off today. Here is his prescription of how perhaps to solve this by the introduction of a Christian education. Let me just find this. This is on page 103 of the Dawson book. It is therefore of vital importance to maintain the key position of the liberal arts college in the university and to save the liberal arts course from further disintegration. And it is with these ends in view that I have made my suggestions for the study of Christian culture as a means of integration and unity. Its function would be very similar to that of the general courses in contemporary civilization, Western civilization, or American culture, which are actually in operation in some of the non-Catholic universities. Indeed, it is the same thing adapted to the needs of Catholic higher studies. For if we study Western culture in the light of Catholic theology and philosophy, we are in fact studying Christian culture in one aspect of it. I believe that the study of Christian culture is the missing link, emphasis, which is essential to supply if the tradition of Western education and Western culture is to survive. For it is only through this study that we can understand how Western culture came to exist and what are the essential values for which it stands. What are these essential values for which Western culture stands? Our final piece today. Another piece of Florentine Mannerist art. This one in particular found in the Galleria dell'Accademia, famous, of course, to house the David of Michelangelo. This is one of those smaller paintings that doesn't get enough respect. I believe that it should. It's sort of on the right. If you enter the Accademia and you see David, if you go to this little alcove on the right, you'll find this painting. The theme, I'm sure, is familiar to most of you. This, of course, is entitled The Sacrifice of Isaac. The artist in this piece is a Florentine painter, Stefano Pieri, operational in the latter stages of the Renaissance. So again, the Mannerist period of art. What is occurring, of course, in this piece, I'm sure it's not strange to, I'm quite familiar to you. Abraham is finally given a son by God the Father. He is asked one day, very oddly, to sacrifice his son. He has misgivings about this, but decides, okay, I'm going to be loyal to this God. I'll bring my son up to offer him up as a sacrifice. At this moment, of course, we see the angel staying Abraham's hand in a rather Mannerist form. If you look at how the limbs are sort of almost serpentine in the way they're almost writhing in that sense, but staying Abraham's hand from slaying his son. Now, I'm guessing that most of you have probably heard of this story very early on in your lives. I heard this going to all boys Jesuit Catholic school a very long time ago. I always assumed this story to be the story of a test of loyalty, or the test of faith, if you will. Will Abraham do the most undoable thing that his God tells him to do? Will he be that faithful? It is that. I'm not saying it's not that. It is very much a part. Loyalty and faith are very much a part of this story. I did hear, however, several years back, a Jewish rabbi, give a very interesting take on this story, which was to say that, yes, this story is very much the tale of a loyalty check of God on Abraham. But if one delves a little bit further, one gleans something else from this story, which is Abraham is about to move into, or has been promised, a land called Canaan. Now, Canaan, as you guys probably know, was not uninhabited. It was not empty of people. There were people living on this land. They were called the Canaanites. By the way, the Canaanites would begin a bloodline that would begin with them. Their children, eventually through the centuries, would be called the Phoenicians, living in the Levant, in the area we call Lebanon. Their descendants, later on, would be the great enemies of Rome, the people of Carthage in northern Africa. Carthage, of course, is found in modern-day Tunis. It is not an African city. It was never an African city. It was a Middle Eastern city, basically transplanted into northern Africa. So this bloodline, beginning with the Canaanites, next with the Phoenicians, and finally with the people of Carthage. So why bring this up? The Canaanites worshiped gods themselves, but they worshiped these gods in very, how should we say, interesting ways. The Canaanites were polytheists. They were not monotheists like the Hebrews were, who only worshipped one God. There were many gods in the pantheon of the Canaanite religious system. One of these gods was called Baal, or Baal, B-A-'-A-L. He will make an appearance, of course, many times in the Old Testament, the book of Kings, the book of Elijah, I believe Jeremiah as well. Baal was a god of the storm, of fertility, of good harvests. He would grant the Canaanites, he would grant their children, the Phoenicians, and their great-grandchildren, eventually the Carthaginians, good harvests, peace, good times, if only they did one thing for him. The payment that Baal or Baal demanded of his followers was blood. Specifically, the blood of the innocent. the practice of taking one's children and immolating them, setting them on fire, causing their deaths in this fashion, was the form of worship first in Canaan, then in Phoenicia, and later on in Carthage. When one thinks of sacrifice in this manner, especially in the BC era, when one thinks of sacrifice, sacrifice is always a vertical proposition. It is always top down. It begins with the God saying, you want something good from me? Okay, I'll give it to you. But you have to give me something first. Now, I don't have to give you what you want just because you give me the sacrifice. But technically speaking, the better sacrifice, the bigger bounty I will give you. The sacrifice demanded by the Canaanites, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians was, of course, innocent blood, their children, as an offering for this horrible god called Baal. So what is the lesson then of the sacrifice of Isaac? God the Father tests the loyalty of Abraham, yes, but he also tells him by stopping and staying his hand not to kill his son, and then set him on fire, by the way, a little burning fire right here on the lower right-hand portion. Wood, of course, right under Isaac, meant to be, to cause more flame in the sacrifice. He is telling Abraham, you are about to move into a place I promised you. You have to bear one thing in mind. You should not be like them. You should not be like these people who, for whatever reason, have fallen under the spell of false gods who demand innocent life as payment for good harvests. As horrible as that sounds, Abraham is being told, you are meant to be something other. Eventually, Moses will be told, you are meant to be a holy people, to be wholly distinct in that fashion. Holy with a W, distinct in that fashion. What distinguishes your people, God telling Abraham, is you are not a culture of death. What you are is a culture that respects, cherishes something very, very simple: the value of one innocent life. There's a basic paradigm, even when you look at something as modern and postmodern as superheroes. I believe it was Richard Weaver who said this, and you can apply this to any sort of superhero you want, movie you want. Richard Weaver said that a hero in a story can never be a relativist, can never be a utilitarian, can never say, well, I'll cause victory to happen if only I shed this person's innocent blood right now. It's a small price to pay. We'll all be good if we just do this really nasty thing and we'll forget about it eventually. No. Heroism, as Weaver says, you can't have that sort of sense. God telling Abraham at this portion of the story is saying the very same thing. You can't be virtuous and look upon life as throwaway, as expedient, as something that does not have value. By the way, something else in this painting that I've kind of skipped over by looking at all the other main elements of the piece. The angel is stopping the hand of Abraham slaying his son, but the other hand of the angel is pointing downward to a sacrifice that Abraham will then sacrifice instead of his son for God. Now, why is this sacrifice here important? Because it brings us back to this. What is the nature of this king? This king, who, as Aquinas would say, is being itself, is the cause of everything else, is the first mover, is the designer of the universe. His measure of love, of caritas, for his creation, is to not demand sacrifice from them, because that's what false gods do. What makes this tradition, this part of Western civilization, unique is it tells us that this being who is so much more powerful, so much more potent than any other earthly monarch, loves his creation to the point of being the sacrifice that will then pay the ransom of our first sin. Dawson sees this as integral. We must teach people values. What is one of the first values we should teach them? That life is sacred, that there is something special about the existence we're living in right now, that we are unique. There is no one like us, and that we all have value. We are all equally valuable. Think again of the scale of equality. Yes, not the equality of Ashurnarshipal, not the equality of a king crushing his people under his iron sandals, but the equality of love, wherein a God who is so far above uplifts people and causes them not to have to suffer justice, but rather gives them mercy. In the words of a Roman speaker, Marcus Tullius Cicero, in his speech, the Contra Catilina, his speech against Lucius Catiline, a very famous Roman senator who wanted to rule Rome and of course failed in his ambitions. Cicero was known for saying in his speech Contra Catilina, "Quousque tandem abutere Catilina, pacientia nostra." How long, Catiline, will you abuse our patience? I have abused all of your patience for too long. Thank you for remaining and watching these slides. And I'm open right now to take questions if you'd like from this point. Sure, Mark, go ahead.
I was reading an essay a couple of days ago, preparation for tonight's meeting, by Googling the title of your talk or of Dawson's book, and came up with an essay with the same title by somebody called Sabine Leitner. I don't know who she is.
Okay.
One of the things that struck me was that she says towards the end of her essay, which is about 7 or 8 pages long, she says that Hitler's engineers at Auschwitz were intelligent and highly trained individuals. And that struck me immediately as showing an example of what happens when you have education which lacks the kind of moral purpose that Dawson and you are saying is so essential, and which we are losing sight of so much in our world today.
It's an excellent point. I believe it was, of all people, Albert Speer at the trials at Nuremberg, when trying to defend himself and perhaps save himself from the hangman's noose. He was trying to say to the audience, to the judges at Nuremberg, how could this have happened to Germany? To the most sophisticated, the most educated people in the world. How could they have fallen this far? Since you mentioned Nazi Germany, I think it's a very apropos point. The word that was used to describe what the Carthaginians, their Phoenician ancestors, and their Canaanite grand ancestors, the word that was used in the Old Testament for this horrific act of sacrificing children to appease false gods, they called this in Greek eventually Holocaust, which literally means whole burnt offering. When Jewish scientists of World War II, Jewish historians of World War II, saw what took place in Eastern Europe, in camps where people were systematically killed, with almost an absence of passion, with a cold method to it. But they saw the smoke from the bodies being burnt. These historians, having known their history, having never relinquished their tradition of moral order, said, we've seen this before. I would argue, by the way, that it is one of the great blessings, but also one of the great curses of those who truly study history, to be able to say, time after time, we've seen this before. There's nothing new under the sun. We have this nature, this competing nature that Augustine writes so eloquently about. And what we have to do, I guess, is try to make sure to give us enough room to do what we should, instead of doing what only we want. Thanks, Mark. That's a really great point. I appreciate it. Any other questions or comments?
What I understand is, if we take a look now, when we look back at Baal, we recognize that he's a false god, right? I mean, we at that time, those people didn't know they were false gods, did they? Because what I'm looking at in today's society, I mean, people seems to be worshiping whatever they want to worship now instead of the true God that we have. So in time, if we look ahead of us, in the future, when people look back, would they see the same thing? What we're seeing now is going back and say, "Oh, Baal was a false god," or anyone else was a false god. And so, when we conduct ourselves and to do what we believe is right, or see what is right and what is wrong individually, and we have nothing to follow, or we're following something different, wouldn't we be in the same situation as, in ancient times?
Well, it's quite possible. Since you brought up whether people back then knew they were worshiping false gods or not, it's a good point.
Right.
I'm not sure if it was Greek historians or Roman historians who would write down that when in Carthage, so I think in this case probably Roman historians, probably Polybius or Livy, when in Carthage, the sacrificial offerings would be placed, just as a description, if you guys know, there was this large, enormous statue of the god, male sort of, a man's body, and well, his arms were stretched forward like this, forming a table. The sacrifice would be put on top of that table. A priest of Baal would pull a lever, and then the body would open up. The sacrifice would roll down into it to be then consumed by flame. Now, we hear of these accounts in Carthage, music being played while this is happening. Now, the music being played was not to say, wow, this is a really cool thing. Let's have a jam right now. No, it was the music was being played to drown out the cries of both the sacrifice and the sacrifice's parents while this was happening. Hannibal, by the way, because in military history, the great general Hannibal, a boy of 8 years old, had his father place his hand on one of these sacrifices to swear eternal hatred against Rome. When the ancients did things, they did things, anyway, they went all the way with things. They didn't do like half measures with things. The Carthaginians, if they were playing music to drown out cries, must have known in some corner of their souls that this was not something else in return, i.e. we are seeing a human being as a means for us to get something else. By the way, modern philosopher Immanuel Kant, one of the best secular ethical systems, I would argue, with no religion in it, says that you have to treat people as ends and not means. That you can't just have people expediently served to get to another place, to get you to point B in that sense. So I'd say that I think, if Aquinas is correct, and that we were all given the sense of natural law, to be able to discern some things are wrong and some things aren't, that the Carthaginians themselves, the Phoenicians and the Canaanites, must have known that something was amiss with this, that this was not as compelling, that this God did not convince them to be good or virtuous, it only convinced them to offer up sacrifices for them. So Dawson perhaps is saying that the more present we can make a moral order, at least when we educate people, is to tell them that we are not just quantifiable things, that we are not just means to somebody else, bringing back Kant again, that we are the truly unique beings that deserve the respect, love, and virtue that we can accord and share with each other. That is the heavenly city, of course, of Augustine.
Yeah, because, this brings up another question. We take a look what Jesus Christ, when he was here, he was basically telling the people who were not, the Jews who were not believers at that time, and they said, you don't know what's in heaven. You only know earthly things. Mm-hmm. And so by doing that, how do the people back then, how would you trust them to know? if Jesus said that, I don't know how to word this. It's the right and wrong,
Yes.
because that's a part that I'm kind of struggling with. Those folks back then, if we're supposed to trust them to see things and see things right, what Jesus Christ said was something different. Said, no, they wouldn't know.
Well, yes, I would agree that they probably wouldn't know what is in heaven. I don't think any of us would know that. But
Well, what's right and wrong in terms of God, what God wanted.
right. To which I would say that when he was asked, have you come to essentially reject whatever what the prophets, the old tradition was? The response was no, right? I mean, the response was no, I'm here to fulfill the law. I've not come to break the law.
Right.
So all those things you've learned before, those still are in place. I'm not like changing, like moving the goalposts, to something else in that sense. All I'm saying is that it's not enough to follow merely law. What you have to do is go beyond that. It's an almost impossible standard of virtue, but it's nevertheless something worth shooting for. At least that's the message I believe in the New Testament, is that it's not enough to not want to harm somebody who you're angry with, but you can't even be angry, right? In that sense. So your virtue has to exceed that of the Pharisees, correct? I mean, in New Testament, in that sense, we have to be better than people who simply follow law, and we do that by being inspired by something else aside from merely following human law, or even divinely inspired law, in that sense. Okay. Okay.
All right.
Esmond, your hand up earlier. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting.
Sure.
I'm a grad student,
Mhm.
and I would say that I don't have a lot of influence in shaping the education that I'm receiving.
Right.
It's more practical and skill-based, less about the values of a person, but I do stem cell biology and regenerative medicine, and I do see some of that in terms of the intuition that people are valuable and that we want to find new ways that we can treat patients.
Yes.
But also at the same time, I see a lot of ego, selfishness, and pride within academia and my field.
Yes.
So I think I'm reminded of this quote by Nicholas Walterstorff that talks about our vocation, that one does not serve God and humanity by going into business and then just playing the received role of a businessman, or going to academia and just playing that received role, but acknowledging that they are religiously fallen and that to serve God faithfully and to serve humanity effectively, we have to critique that received role and do what we can to alter the script. So I was just wondering, what you thought about that, and what can my role be as at the bottom of the food chain as a grad student?
Right. Let me try to answer that by bringing up a little bit of Socrates from the Apology. When in a trial for his own life, Socrates will not renounce being a philosopher. He will not renounce teaching philosophy. He is given the choice, by the way, of exile or taking hemlock or taking poison to kill himself. But he will not disavow his calling and vocation. And by the way, Socrates has no Judeo-Christian friends. It's not existing at that time, but he's sort of onto it a little bit. Socrates will say, in the trial for his life, please remind the people who want to follow me that your one job, if you're a teacher, is not sharing info with people. Because frankly, especially these days, you can get info anywhere you want. You can get any source you want. I mean, much easier than back then. You had to find some sort of teacher to tell you things. That's what Socrates' enemies, the sophists, would say, is that a teacher's job is simply giving you knowledge. You know nothing. You're an empty slate. We're simply putting knowledge inside your head. Socrates says that a teacher's job is even much more difficult. It is making sure that you convince your students, as best as they can, to caretake their souls. Now, again, this is not Judeo-Christian. This is not souls going to heaven, meeting St. Peter, getting a harp, with wings. Not that kind of soul. This was a soul thought of by the ancient Greeks, who would say, we have this inner constitution that needs to be ordered. You can't have it in disorder. You can't have the appetites telling you what to do, to follow whatever you want as far as desire goes. You have to somehow rein those in. As a teacher, frankly, I see my job I'm not Socrates. I maybe aspire to be as great as that one day, but not really. That would be pride. That would be a bad thing. However, I would say that young people look to us for what to do in times that are especially very trying times right now. To which I would always give reminders, look, you have to do what's best for yourself and your family, of course. That's very important in these times. That takes precedence over, reading my assignments or my page numbers, whatever. That's not really that important. But always bear in mind that you can't do a wrong thing to get a right goal, right? There has to be certain limits. Socrates knew it in terms of human freedom. The New Testament knows it in terms of natural law. There's sort of a guide inside you that says you should know when to stop. Civilization, I would argue, in general, in very broad terms, a great civilization can sometimes be judged by what it does to be great. Right? The Romans building aqueducts when nobody else knew what that was. The ancient Greeks building beautiful architecture. But truthfully, maybe a better standard would be judging a civilization by what it would not do. In G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, there is a chapter on the war of Carthage versus Rome. It's called The War of the Gods and the Demons. And there Chesterton says that what makes Rome unique is it is yet untouched by revelation. It doesn't have Christianity yet, but it sees something abhorrent in what the Carthaginians are doing, in the way they do things. The same year that Rome defeats Carthage, 146 BC, it also goes to war with Greece. It defeats Corinth, the Greek city-state of Corinth that year. One big difference. Whereas Rome defeats Corinth but preserves Greece, Rome destroys Carthage to the last brick. There are stories that say that the Roman soldiers strew salt on the fields of Carthage to say this place will never grow again. There was something bad about this place. We don't have Judeo-Christian sort of revelation yet, so we can't put it in those terms. But our own understanding, Aquinas would say, natural law allowed the Romans to say, hey, people can't do this. There is something abysmally wrong about this kind of behavior. So the Romans, in their way, knew what they should not do, that they could not be like that. So I guess the best thing I can say as you further your education, and again, all best wishes in your future success, is try to cultivate a sense of those things that you know are worth doing, and those things which you would say, getting to that point would take too high of a cost. And perhaps we should think of alternate ways before we do that. Hope that helps.
Thanks very much.
No problem. Yeah. Any other questions before we close?
Adam Lee, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. It's been pretty short. I just want to say thank you for your comments on the story of Abraham and Isaac. That's always obviously a sort of a crucial story when it comes to difficult moral dilemmas that you'll find in the Bible and what to take away from them.
Yes.
Now, I don't expect you to have an answer to this, but the two different ways I've heard that story sort of described is, on the one hand, you have Abraham trusting, being loyal to God and following through on what he was commanded, but at the same time, people frequently like to point to some sort of hint that Abraham had faith that God was going to provide an alternate sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Which, on the one hand, is very attractive because we put a high emphasis on faith in Christianity. But on the other hand, almost seems like a cheat. Like if Abraham really thought that he wasn't going to be going through with it, then in what sense was he really truly being tested? Was it a test of his faith, or was it a test of his loyalty? And of course, the other view is that it was a pure test of his loyalty, and Abraham was willing to give the thing that was most valuable to him to God, because he loved him, because his love of God was so great, or what have you. So,
in order to answer that, could I screen share really quickly, try to answer that and bring back that painting again?
Yeah, please. I'll say that I really like the perspective that you repeated from that Jewish tradition you mentioned, which was pointing at thinking of the story more in terms of a symbol pointing the Abrahamic tradition away from the pagan traditions that were surrounding them.
Which I think would be rather vital as far as a distinction between the two. Are we good with the painting? Okay. In order to answer the question, that's something, by the way, I've also thought about, Adam, and perhaps one way I can maybe answer it through the art is if you look at the gaze of Abraham, it's directly downward. Meaning this is a very purposeful thing he's doing. I don't think, at least from my perspective, I don't think there's a sense of looking down at Isaac, if you will, and saying, oops, I'm going to be thrown a lifeline here. There's a concentration to this. By the way, things to take note also in the painting, yes. The way he's focused, the eyes are almost invisible. They're just sort of darkened over. The knife, something that I only noticed in the last couple of days before I was doing this presentation. When you've seen blades in classical paintings and Renaissance paintings, they take different forms and shapes. This is curved. Something that you would use essentially for an animal. Like when you go out and go hunting, very rarely will you find a hunting knife that is straight edged. That's something you find in war, to sort of attack an enemy with. This is something, a very purpose-built sort of device he's using. So at least for me, with the painting being as it is, it doesn't seem like I see someone, and I speak of this as a father myself, loves my children. This is a horrendous thing to be asked to do, an ultimate test of faith that I can only say Abraham is able to do, that the rest of us, would really have a very hard time doing, that he's very special in that sense. But I think that very much his focus was on the task and not on any potential of being somehow stopped, which he was, of course, in the end.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
No problem. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I appreciated your talk very much.
Of course.
I'm a long-time educator. My question to you, having taught both in law and business schools, I've walked away. I now teach at a major Texas university, public university in Texas in the business department. And I guess as I walk away, there's been, since the 1940s and 50s, when the GIs came back from World War II, and the idea was to sort of industrialize and create an economic value out of universities and move away from the liberal arts model towards more of an economic generator for society.
Right.
I see this in both the fields I've taught in, that the true value that the university holds for the students is in two capacities. One, the ability to produce voters who keep the politicians in place. And second, the tax value walking out of the university ultimately. And I guess my question to you is, as an educator, I'm simply inundated with students. I have 150 to 200 students a semester. I barely know anybody's name half the time, if I'm lucky. And as I get older, I can't remember names anyway. But the question I have to you is, with that tidal mass coming through a push for economic valuation, and for sort of a voter class that's obedient to the king, if you will, how do you propose reinculcating Christian values in mass like that?
Great question. In my philosophy class at the university, I have students read primary texts. And we read a lot of Plato in that class, wherein the care of the soul is paramount. I will then pose different issues and dilemmas to them to see what, how they would balance these things out. I think if we bring students to a good well to draw from, as an academic, I can very much empathize with you. I've done this since the late 1990s. I tried to think of myself as, in many ways, a glorified curator, as someone who is privileged enough to have been exposed to a body of knowledge that is both profound, but also rather virtuous and benign in that sense, in an uplifting way. What we can do is expose students to this and have them read it, have them read the material as best we can, and see what they think about it. I've noticed with students, especially in the last several years, it's very tech-oriented, of course, but if you take sort of an old school approach, which I usually do, here's the book, I'll read it with you, we'll read it together, to expose them to things which you believe would be good for them. Now, of course, the big challenge is in finding those specific works. I was very fortunate in my undergraduate years to have gone to St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, where we read the great books of the Western world. That is Homer through Einstein in 4 years. That, by the way, is no guarantee you're going to end up being a virtuous citizen of the world. Not at all. But it does expose you to Plato's dialogues. It does expose you to the book of Psalms in the New Testament. It does expose you to some pretty important things, which are always there for us to tap into, if only we care to look at them. If only we take the time to sort of go to that font and to try to draw some of that water. Now, again, I say that we can't necessarily make the students drink from that water. You know, we can bring the horse there, but the best we can do is be a conduit to better sorts of learning that are better for them, and not only showing them to be better critical thinkers, to be sharper writers, but also perhaps to begin thinking about what it means to be a better person. And we can do it in small ways. Those are the ways, at least, I try to do it. Hope that helps.
Thank you.
I got a question. Joyce was handing me. Anne in the chat wanted to know the name of the artist. Can I ask which artist were you interested in knowing?
The last image.
Stefano Pieri, Pieri. Very little on him, by the way, as far as background goes, but I was very struck by that painting at the Accademia.
Thank you.
Sure.
Jose, this is David Thoreau. In reference to the previous question from Christopher,
yes.
When you teach Plato and so forth, you also use C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
And you know, his book, The Abolition of Man, I think, tries to integrate many of the same points that Dawson tries to integrate. So that would be a recommendation I would make to Christopher.
Very much so. The Abolition of Man, I believe, Mere Christianity. I'm not saying it because I'm very fond of it. I did lead a book discussion on this a couple of years ago. But Mere Christianity has a terrific section on dealing with pride, on the dangers of pride, you know, on why we should sort of avoid that as much as we can. So Lewis is quite profound in the presentation of that. Help anybody else? Any questions? Oh, Mark, go ahead.
Make one more remark. You showed that picture of Abraham almost killing Isaac.
Yes.
The knife looked like the sort of knife you'd use to kill an animal.
Yes.
And that reminded me then that about Nazi Germany, that what they'd done was to achieve the effect of thinking of a certain group of people as if they were animals.
Yes.
That's what we have to be so careful to avoid. And I think one of the ways that I personally avoid it, I look at my screen right now, my Zoom screen. I see each of you, those of you who have your cameras on. Sure. I see your faces and I see a cross, your eyes and your nose. And when you see that cross and you recognize that each person is made in the image of God, no matter who they are, no matter whether you like them or don't like them, that's a tremendously powerful, for me at least, way of handling that issue.
Agreed. Of the infinite value in that person.
Yeah.
As well. Thank you. Okay. Any questions? Are we all good? Happy to have you guys for the talk, and hope it was of benefit for you in the discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for joining with us across the country and in the Bay Area. And especially our special thanks to Jose for his wisdom and patience with us and good will in bringing all this wonderful material together. It's just been thrilling. So thank you, Jose.
Thank you.